Greetings, everyone. Peter Maravellis here. Tonight on City Lights Live, we are celebrating the publication of Hafizah Augustus Geter's new book, The Black Period, on Personhood, Race, and Origin, published by Random House Books. In this groundbreaking memoir, the acclaimed poet brings together lyrical prose with incisive criticism and some very compelling visuals to reclaim her origin story as the queer daughter of a Muslim Nigerian immigrant and a Black American visual artist. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone, as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to acknowledge those who have come before us as stewards of the land with an offering of respect. Hafizah Augustus Geter is a Nigerian-American writer, an amazing poet, and has also worked as a literary agent. She is the author of the poetry collection titled Un-American, an NAACP Image Award and PEN Open Book Award finalist. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, Bomb, The Believer, Paris Review, amongst many other publications. She is a Breadloaf Catherine Bakeless Nonfiction Fellow, a Cave Canem Poetry Fellow, and the 92Y Women in Power Fellow. She has served as the Poetry Committee Co-Chair of the Brooklyn Literary Council and holds an MFA in nonfiction from NYU, where she was an Axine Fellow. She makes her home in Brooklyn, New York. Joining her in conversation is Kiese Laymon. Kiese Laymon is the author of the bestseller Heavy, an American memoir, which won the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, as well as the Christopher Isherwood Prize for Autobiographical Prose. Mr. Laymon is also the author of the essay collection How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America and the genre-defying novel Long Division. A contributing editor for Vanity Fair, he's also written for numerous publications, including Gawker, NPR, Color Lines, Ebony, Guernica, The Guardian, and many, many others. He has taught at the University of Mississippi, Vassar College, Iowa Writers Workshop, and is currently professor of English and creative writing at Rice University. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to our guests, Hafizah Augustus Geter, Kiese Laymon. It is such a pleasure and an honor to have you both with us. Such a joy. Welcome to City Lights.
Hey. Thank you so much, City Lights. Thank you so much for having us. And Hafizah, like, I'm so excited to get into this book. So excited that I pulled over on the side of the road in Oklahoma because I couldn't get to my hotel to get this in. But I'm really excited and thankful. You know how much I love you. You know how much I love your work. So I just want to start off by saying just thank you for asking me to do this.
Oh, thank you for doing this. Once we pulled over the side of the road in Oklahoma, listen, if anything happens, we can be like, it's all right, he's a writer.
Yo, actually, I'm at a Sonic, so we're gonna, this conversation.
Oh, you're okay then. You better order
I'm gonna
something.
be all right. I'm gonna be all right at this Sonic. But listen, let's get into this, fam. Like,
Absolutely.
I have a lot of questions. I actually have a lot of like sentences that I want to actually talk to you about. We're both sentence people and verse people. But I want to start overall thinking and talking about like the various tones that you create in this book. A lot of us, whether we want to admit it to or not, when I say us, I'm talking about myself, feel like when I'm writing in some way about the most serious, intense subjects, I feel like I have to pull out all of my fucking things on my tool belt. Namely, I got to use some comedy, I got to use some dramatic scene, I got to do all of these things in some way to distract the reader from the seriousness of what I'm doing. I've been taught. One of the things you do in the Black period is you say, fuck that. We are writing about serious shit in serious times. So I'm going to utilize a lot of different tones, but these tones are never going to let you forget how absolutely layered and serious. Like, I mean, serious is really the word I'm thinking that I want to hear you explore. How did you come to be okay with using such varied, absolutely serious tones throughout this? Not to say there's not any laughter and there's not a lot of smiles. There are. But I think you let us know from page 1 into the last page that the stakes of what you're exploring are absolutely out of this world. Tell me about that.
I think you froze a little bit, or I froze a little bit. But so like, just think about like the different tones I'm employing.
Yeah, and particularly about the seriousness of the tones.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's like serious business, like one's history that we're talking about. But I tried to make it as close to what it is to live a life, that
Yeah.
there are highs, there's lows, there's laughter. Like you think about you go to, even if when you're like at a protest full of Black people, there's laughter, there's joy, there's dancing. And there's a part of the book that, like, we're at a protest and talk about how you sometimes can't tell the difference between, like, it's like a scale between like Kwanzaa and Freaknik, and like there's like color guards, there's all these sorts of things. And so like I wanted to really lean into that, because even though I'm exploring, some very serious things, it all can't there has to be joy, because I
Yes.
think as Black people, we are the hope experts, right? And so
Right.
I couldn't write a genuine book that didn't have hope.
And hope and joy are explored in such different colors to me in this book, and so many of the colors I think are like sentence based. One of the sentences that I just wish I could get tattooed on the inside of my brain is flowers taught themselves to code switch. Fair. Did you hear me when I said that one? How, where, and how were you when you wrote that sentence? Flowers taught themselves to code switch. And this comes in a fucking chapter where you were like doing like geological excavation. Like you are taking us inside the earth, you're taking us inside flowers. But that line, flowers taught themselves to code switch. Talk to me about that.
Well, yeah, and so I really wanted the book to also kind of embrace nature. I feel like Black people are some of the original outside people, and really trying to embrace our love of nature. And this idea of the last chapter, I'm kind of twinning like the just coming to terms with like my mother's death, and like all the things that I'm talking about in the book, as she's essentially taking a road trip with my sister. It's the last road trip she takes before she dies, in which it almost seemed like she knew that she was going to die. And I twin it with this idea of like around the birth of flowers, written by there's this short essay, I think if they made it into like a book, by Lauren Isley, about like the birth of flowers. And just at one point in the world, flowers didn't exist, so there was no color, and then
Right.
just one day flowers burst across the earth,
Yeah.
and but like in terms of geological time, that's like the last second on the of the earth. And just thinking that like what it means to that flowers came and they changed everything, and
Yes.
Black people, and I saw the connection, because with flowers, the seeds of flowers were other people's prey,
Right.
right? And they took that prey and they propagated as prey, despite being prey. And I did the similarities just between that and what Black people do all the
Yes.
time is, I
Yeah.
think it was like undeniable.
And you also do this thing where you take us into histories that some of us thought we knew, and especially what you did with Compton, fam. Like, I read that chapter over and over and over again, and I don't think it's too much to ask you to talk a little bit about Compton,
Yeah.
particularly in the CAA, because like a lot of us do know or think we know something about Compton. We think we know something about Compton because we know that Compton used to be a white neighborhood. Black folks from the South came out there, NWA. But you take us deeper than that, and you also tie so much of what we think we know about Compton to what we should know about Compton and what we should know about indigeneity. So can we talk a bit about specifically about Compton and about the CAA?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Compton comes up a few times, and in a few ways. So in one way, it's in relationship to a case that, so students in the Compton Unified School District, they sued the school district to get essentially complex traumas be qualified under disability. And what that meant was, like, for example, that included a girl who did not want to have to be forced to attend class with her rapist, right? And so these are huge, like huge things. And there, especially in Compton, that the kids that live there experience so much violence that I think so that they can experience more violence than some soldiers, right? And so they sued to essentially make the school have to accommodate their complex traumas. Because I think at one point, like there was an assigned teacher to attend students' funerals because there were so many students' funerals that the teachers couldn't handle it. So they made one person take it all a year, which is just like absolutely wild. And so, but like, this is what we think of Compton, right? But the idea that they sued the school district and they won, and what they demanded from the school district is not only that they needed more school counselors, like trauma counselors. They argued that every single teacher had to be trained in trauma counseling because students, like, this is a school to prison pipeline of essentially students who are traumatized and then making their trauma a crime, right? After you've traumatized them, like, then you make it illegal for them to respond to the trauma. But like, they won. And I think that in the following year, I think something wild, like the suspension or expulsion rate went from like an orange level to 0 in a year. Like, scores skyrocketed. And years later, a school called Hafizah Elementary, and which is like their schools in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, they use the Compton's case as precedent for their case. And so you essentially have some of the two most like under-resourced kids in the country who have taken on the Goliath of the government and now have changed education or have the possibility to change education for every single school in the country, every single student in the country, which is amazing. But then also, I wanted to resist the idea of like, what is the story where we start, right? And so I think Janice Miller's actually here. She's who I kind of like, I found her work. She's a writer and an urban planner. I found her work, and when she was talking about the CAA and just reminding us that before we all saw Friday, like, Compton's was the home of arts, right? That they literally transformed the community through community. They had like a bunch of artists had come together to create like a arts education, a place to gather. Like they had like they had a theater, they had all sorts of things, and you can see the like there are a few murals left in Compton that just show this. But this idea that this place that only lives in our imagination for many people through as this kind of Ice Cube-ish, very violent place, is the place that kind of like that birthed this art scene. And also this place that like so many people still like reach to for their own credibility, and wanting to show that Black people, we are a layered people.
And the hope that you etch out in this book is layered, like so layered, so layered that there's a part of me that didn't even want to call it hope. But like, what I think that you've done is like in recasting and redrawing hope as, among other things, Black. You also cast the imagination as Black, not a Black part of the imagination, but imagination is Black. Talk to me about that. The imagination is as Black.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to quote someone who we all love, this is a Black abundance, right? And that, like, I quote you in the book that this idea of like, think about the idea that we were never supposed to exist essentially like in this country, right? We were supposed to be labor, and that's it, property. And then so to imagine yourself into all of this, everything that we've become, is incredible. And that like every day, the act of just being Black every day in this country is an act of imagination, because we are actively try to keep us out of this country by also forcing us to be the engine of like this carceral racial capitalism. And so to imagine anything, I think, in like as in this country is, as Black people, is incredible. And, you know, my father often says that Black people are the most patriotic people in this country, because otherwise we would have burned it to the ground, given what we have experienced. But this idea that, you know, this country is built on ideals that it can't maintain, and Black people and people of color are always working to try to help this country imagine itself into its own ideals, you know. And just I think about just the way like Black people, we remix everything, whether it be just like music, language, so much, that I think that like we are the end. We so much of what we do is like the engine of culture. Think about like pop culture is just Black culture in many ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm also taken by the way I mean, I think the easy way to talk about it is implication, but I think what's so interesting to me is like when you turn, and I feel like the book is always doing this, but it's turning its like super perceptive, like sort of vision, like outward into the world, into the ground, up into the sky, but also into the human being who is writing the book, right? And into your family. And one of the things you say about your father that I just think we just got to get in this is you say that I want to make sure I got the quote right. You say that your father was skeptical of any notion of God, yet always trying to get you to heaven. Can we talk about that? Love
You
that
know,
line. I love that.
I mean, my father is a Black man born in 1945 in George Wallace's Alabama. You know, Jim Crow was the law of the land until you know, he couldn't legally go to desegregated schools until he was 15. You know, say the quote to me one more time.
It was a quote where you say, my father really didn't really invest in any
Yes,
notion of God,
yes.
but he was steady trying to get us to heaven.
I think that it's like the this relationship of, you know, when you think of religion and God in this country, it's so complicated. But I think that also that it's also so intertwined with Blackness, this idea of like, I grew up with surrounded by religions. You know, I went to Catholic school in my childhood. My mother was Nigerian Muslim, and my father was essentially like a Latin Baptist who stopped going to school stopped going to church like after he went to college. But like he went to like the Sweet Daddy Grace revivals, right? So he was deep in it, and this idea that, you know, okay, like if I do I not believe in God? It's like, as a Black person, I don't even I don't know if those can be separated,
right,
you know,
right,
because it's
right.
because faith is so integral into this. And so I think my father, you know, his story of why he stopped going to church is he came to visit his mom when he was coming back from college, and the preacher gave a whole sermon about how they'd forgotten his birthday or something ridiculous. And my dad was just like, you know, this congregation had bought him a Cadillac, paid for his house, sent his kids to school, you know, and after that, like, he walked out, right? And so I think that, but I wouldn't say that my father is a man without faith, you know.
Right.
I think despite his struggles with faith, I think that his faith is so strong because his faith in people. You know, I don't think you can't make art the way my father does. You can't paint people the way my father does if you don't believe in people. Yeah. You know, and that in like the godliness of people, whatever you want godliness to mean. You know, and so even though he might not be a part of the church, but he believes in transcendence, you know, and he believes in that transcendence the way I think that Black people do in community.
Right, right. And, you know, and there's a section in the book where you're talking about, you know, what your family has done for the land and the acceptance that when the apocalypse comes, none of that work that they did on the land is going to do any good in terms of protecting you. Like, that shit hurt.
Yeah.
and revealed. But can you talk about like the writing of that sentence and the acceptance that goes into that sort of proclamation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by the apocalypse because how
Yes.
many times have we passed through it already, you know? And
Right.
the apocalypse for who? And I think that we're in a place where people are always worried about the apocalypse. So like you wouldn't recognize the apocalypse if you saw it because it's already come many times, you know? And if you
Yep.
think about the way this has happened, but this idea of like we're never imagined into the end of the world. And I think someone recently in Harper's wrote about fantasy and race
Hmm.
and how that like fantasy for white people how they're upset with like black characters is because it robs them of their relief like
Right.
from us, right?
Right.
And so that the end of the world for them is a white space, right? But at the end of the day, it's not like we have like between like people of color have essentially shaped this land. We are the
Yeah.
engine behind it. And what it means that like when the apocalypse comes, just like have no land to run to because like we don't own property in
Right.
the way that like white people are able to like don't have guns, right? And so the idea of it's not the apocalypse that I can't survive. It's essentially whiteness that
Yeah.
like will make it so impossible and for whiteness itself to survive itself. But I think that at the end of the day, we are deeply equipped to survive the apocalypse because like we're in a version of it now.
Right. Right. Daily. Daily.
Daily.
And and you do this thing where so we'll have that in the book, and then not far from that we'll have a sentence that really throws a wrench in everything we thought we read. And one of them is like where you say, I know that I'm an American because I accept my pleasures at any cost. And I remember the first time I read that shit, like that was when, that's when everybody was talking about how nobody was wearing masks and now nobody's
Yeah.
wearing masks at all. So, but talk about that. I mean, because it's such an interesting quote. I know I am an American because I accept my pleasures at
Yeah.
any cost.
Yeah, I think so I was kind of thinking about that. I'm pretty sure that's in the chapter that I think like simulacrum
Yep.
or God's country. Yeah. And that chapter really started off as I was talking to my friend Camille Rankin, who's in the book. And I was just like so many of these chapters just me trying to figure things out. And for that, I was trying to figure out it's like, okay, like I know like in my head that war is the most defining aspect of my life, but as an American, I don't see it. And so I
Right.
was just trying to figure out that because that disconnect is how complicity works, right? And
Yep.
so like even just like looking around my apartment, all things that are like most of this is manufactured elsewhere, right? And you think about the economic costs of that, and then just like the exploitation that goes into that. And we are intentionally like overwhelmed with complicity so we can't
Yeah.
dismantle it, and the thing is you do that to survive because you can't have to think about like all the lives ruined to make all this,
Yeah.
and just really trying to think that, what does it mean that even though this country is death, that like as a Black queer woman, it's one of my best chances at life.
Woo. Mm. Damn good. Oh, woo. Sonny going crazy on that line, child. All the lights going off. And this is and this is one of the things that I love about what you do in this book. You give yourself time to explore. I'm not gonna say all the parts of you, but the parts of you that you do give yourself time to explore, you don't just like, you're not just sort of like gesturing at them. Like particularly when you talk about being in that house and missing people and missing flirting and missing having a crush. And then you drop this line, which to me at this point in my life was just like, oh my goodness, I needed it. You say, I am relieved to be reminded there are so many ways to be married. In a book called The Black Period, I just think that line is incredible no matter what, but it's so incredible in this book. So I'm interested, can you talk about what this sentence has to do with the Black period? I'm relieved to be reminded that there are so many ways to be married.
Yeah, I funny, my wife is on this too, so I bet she's real interested in this answer. You know, I think that it's this idea of that that none of us get the stories we deserve, right? When
Right.
you think about the stories that we have about the ways to be, whether it's Blackness, queerness, womanhood, or marriage, you see all these. I think heterosexual people are having a really hard time right now. You know, like, I don't know if you see all these like pieces that are coming out that's just like it's okay to hate your partner. You know, like that's what marriage is about. You know, or straight men are finding it very difficult in the dating world because women have raised their standards on because women want to be treated as a human. You know, it's all this ridiculous things, but this idea of that once you're able to detach yourself from what you're told you have to be, that like a whole world of possibility like actually opens up for you. And I think that there's so many ways to be in relationships, so many ways to be married, and it's a relief because you know the examples of marriage that I had, even though my parents had a great marriage, like they were all heterosexual, right? It was just like the 90s were just like in Akron, Ohio, were very heterosexual. I didn't have those examples. And then to see that we could build a whole world inside our relationship. Kiese needs to be muted.
Okay, sorry. I know. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry. Just a little few mistakes on my end with this little phone. Yeah, but like you know what, and you know when you read books, I mean, I'm sure you do this now, and actually ever since I met you, were doing this. You know, we read books as readers, we read books as writers, we read books as potential like readers of the writing we read that might be in a book. Was there any fear at all in writing and bringing us into that part of your life at all?
You know, I just had to jump and do it. I mean, but like after like my agent was just like, you need to really jump into it. And then Camille was just like, you need to jump into it. And the matter was like, you need to jump into it. And I'm just like, fine. You know, fine. But I think, you know, it was by the nature of what I was trying to unpack, because, you know, when I'm trying to unpack all these systems that press against my identities, and that took me to shame, right? That, and you know, invoke bell hooks in honor of her birthday. Like one of the quotes I mention is how bell hooks describes shame, and that like it's a tool of white supremacy and like patriarchy, because shame produces paralysis. And paralysis like makes it so you can't advocate for yourself, right? And just really feel like, how could I push against that? And one way, it's just like there was no way to tell this story without dismantling the shame and asking like, who is my shame for? Who is it helping? Who's it service to?
Right. And I'm thinking about like the importance or significance of shame actually when drawing these maps, because so much of what you're doing in this book is like mapping, right? And like and I love that you've given some of us another route to explore what map making actually is. But one of the things you say is that, you know, if we keep drawing our maps into each other, we cannot be erased.
Yeah.
All right. And the thing about that is like it's an incredible metaphor, but I don't actually think you even mean it just as a metaphor. I think you mean that metaphorically, of course, but literally as well. Because in book, in a lot of ways, is a kind of mapping exercise into so many different kinds of people. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, because like one of the things I'm trying to figure out in the book, I asked the question like, I'm quoting book critic Pearl Sagal, but asked like, what does it look like to emerge from erasure? You know, like that that needs more than a metaphor. You know, it needs like you actually have to draw a map out. And so I think for me, really focusing on, you know, how do we do this? And do me a favor, ask your question one more time.
Yeah, I guess I was just interested in like how you literally were drawing a literary and actual like physical geographic map in this book, right? Playing with origins, playing with possibility. And so when you say like our only hope is to kind of draw maps into one another,
Yeah.
I'm just interested in how you mean that literally in this book.
Like, well, I think the example of the Havasupai Elementary case and the Compton case are perfect examples of that, because one of the things I say in the chat, in like the chapter where the CA in Compton comes up, is that between like the Compton students and the Havasupai students, like the family, because the families are the ones leading this charge, and
Yes.
that both but also the children are fighting on behalf of themselves, and they show what like, you know, what Black people have always known, that, you know, a village is not just required for a child, that a village is what a child is owed, you
Yeah.
know. And that, and I think that's why it's also so important for me that, like, okay, I'm writing a book about Blackness and white supremacy, but I also, just because that's where my story starts doesn't mean that's actually where my story starts, right?
Right,
Because
right, right.
people were here first and had other atrocities, and our atrocities are connected. And you know, the book opens at the Grand Canyon, and I'm thinking about this immensely beautiful landscape where you can see essentially the beginning of time, like literally in a canyon. And in the meantime, the Havasupai tribe is down there. They're the oldest documented people in North America, right? They're the first peoples, which is just like also incredible. And thinking, okay, what thinking through like what they have experienced, and you realize that, okay, though our oppressions might be different, what we have in common is our traumatizers.
That's right.
And I think that is like supremely important to always kind of like keep in mind, that like we have these things in common so we can dismantle them. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is, I think one of the most important books I've ever read is Harsha Walia's Border and Rule. Is just like absolutely incredible, and she's connecting how borders are connected to gender oppression, to climate change. But you know, I think one of the things she talks about is how it's easy to get overwhelmed, right? It's
Definitely.
easy to just get overwhelmed that all this stuff is going on. But when you see that all these oppressions, whether it is ableism, like anti-Blackness, like Islamophobia, homophobia, that it's all connected. They all share the same head of the monster. And so if you do your thing, I do my thing, we all work on it. We're all working towards dismantling that head, right? And so
Absolutely.
that, like, that's how our maps are drawn to each other, because we recognize, you know, Miriam Kaba says, like, she's like, you know, prison abolitionist, and she says, like, part of the work of organizing is to help us understand who we're supposed to be mad at. And I think
Right.
that's one of the things that it's so easy in this country to get distracted from, like, who we're supposed to be mad at. Like, we're all supposed to be mad at Jeff Bezos. Like,
Yeah.
for the record, you
Right,
know?
right. You know, well, I want to let me just encourage everybody to who's interested to please put your questions in the chat. There's a really important question I want to get to that speaks to the way you actually were able to, like, you know, juggle, navigate, weave through all of this. But I want to talk about not necessarily your pain, but the way you wrote chronic pain into this
Yeah.
text, and why it was important for you not to have a chapter here about chronic pain, a section here, but like
Yeah.
that was something you know, people always talk about braided novels and braided essays and braided memoir, but like that is something we never forget, right? And it's not that we just remember, oh, Hafiz is in pain. Like, you take us to your back, you take us to, like, you know, you bending over. Talk about the importance of chronic pain in the Black period.
Yeah, I mean, because thinking about the experience of the body, you know, is that America is a very physical experience, right? The work to survive in this country is backbreaking in many ways. But then also, so like, I have a chronic pain issue, and trying to figure out how to navigate it when there are so many things that can exacerbate it beyond just like what is going wrong. It is stress exacerbates it, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about the way, the stress of being a Black woman when we know that like this country literally weathers us to death, right? And to this idea of that, like, we live with pain all the time. And I think I open it with one of the things I open the Grand Canyon chapter talking about this writer Leah Lakshmi Pripsnasara, can't say her name, but she wrote this book, Care Work, and she says that, for Black and Indigenous people, that being sick or disabled can just be life. And think about, like, think about your grandma, think about all your aunties, right? And uncles, right? Like the way that the world bent them over, just like the work of the world, right? And so, but to be able to identify what disability is. And so again, it's being able to identify, like, where are we structurally positioned? Because it's easy to be like, if you don't see yourself as disabled, because there are people, the number of people that have disabilities is astronomical, and so many people don't identify with that, which means they can't advocate for themselves. So that's the goal, like, don't identify with that, and you can't advocate for that. And people with disabilities is exploding through long COVID, right? So this is a serious issue, and everybody will become disabled because we all age, right?
That's right.
But just like also thinking of how we are conditioned to chronically hurt as Black people, right? Like, and I talk about how growing up, like, we didn't have the word for disability in that way. It just, like, disability just meant a check was late, or it came,
That's right.
right? Like,
That's right.
but the thing is, but we didn't assign value to what people can produce in capitalism. And so really centering that this country and living has a cost, and it's a physical cost, and also what it means to all the ways having to deal with chronic pain. So this, like, invisible disability, how it makes you, if like there's shame around that, it makes it so you can't advocate for yourself. And that is the work of this country, is doing everything it can to make sure we can't advocate for ourselves. Like, that is why there is such a hard come down on unions, right? Even though, like, people are unionizing all over, and I love it. But this importance that, like, that at what we are doing has a physical cost, and that you can't always see it.
Absolutely. We got some tough questions up in here. And I know people came to hear their questions answered. So let me start with this one. I haven't read your book yet, but I plan to. In the meantime, I'm interested in how capacious this book seems: history, culture, the personal, also the visual art, which we didn't talk about yet, by your father. How did you manage all these elements? I'm curious about the writing process within this capaciousness.
Yeah, I think that with each chapter, and thank you, Victoria, for each chapter, I kind of like had something that I was trying to figure out for myself, and for the overall book, the questions that I was trying to figure out, it's like how to, like, and I used other people's questions, which really helped me root me. So Pearl's questions becomes like the work of the book, but also a question I had for myself that I wanted to figure out is, like, how long is history, and how long do I have to be responsible for it? So really trying to understand deep time inside of a single lifetime. And so in terms of actually putting this all together, when I think for me, one of the most important things was, like, one, trust my reader, because we don't think on a straight line, right? Like, we experience time collapsing and moving in and out in a single moment. Like, when you're talking to your parent, your time is going in and out. You're never just in the present, in that moment. And so, like, we understand how to grapple with time. And so I wanted to create a narrative that kind of, like, honors the way we like have to go through the world, trying to make something as mimetic as possible. But, like, on a craft side, I also knew that, okay, like, I'm trying to do a lot in this book, and I'm asking readers to hold a lot. And so trying to figure out how through form can I make things easier. And so I read a lot of craft books. I mean, like I read a lot of fiction craft books too.
Yeah.
And just like also just read an enormous amount of people who are being like inventive with text, right? But one of the things I also did for each chapter, I had like a vibe that I wanted to achieve. So there's a chapter where we're in California and we're in Runyon Canyon, and we're kind of trying to, I'm with my friend Daniel and trying to like think through both climate change that's happening in California, but also happening in Columbia, like South Carolina as well. And like when we're at the top of Runyon Canyon, California is burning, but you
Right.
can't see it. All you see is a beautiful landscape,
Right.
right? But and then meanwhile, there's like it's hurricane season in Columbia, and thinking, and so I wanted it to feel like a hurricane in a storm. And so I was just like, I wanted it to be like we're at the top of a mountain, like on top of like, you know, this canyon. And so to be able to zoom in and out. So we zoom like, so from the top of the canyon, like we have like binoculars in our heads that we can like see Compton, then we can see my father in South Carolina, then we come back and see it. So I wanted it to be, I wanted it to feel like the storm that is brewing, since I'm talking about like climate change. There's a chapter where it's kind of like an address to my late Nigerian grandmother Yaya, and we moved to America when I was 3, and after that I only went back twice. One when I was first grade with my mom and my sister, and then later after my mom died, me and my sister went to visit her. But like we never shared. That was all that I saw her. Like we didn't have like the internet in terms of talk like that, but also we also didn't never shared language. And so when you look at the chapters, like how do you experience, like how do you express fracture? And so one of the things that I do in that section is these are all prose blocks. So like it's really to lean into the lacuna that a country and immigration and also generations cause, right? And all the absence that is between us. And so really trying to find things that can like guide the reader to be like, this is what this is supposed to feel like in the body, and having it to recreate that shape on the page.
And your father's art, I just want to make sure that
Yeah. And so I think for me, like there was never an iteration of this book that I ever made that didn't have the art. And for those who are looking, there's just like different Trump coming out of what's his name. My father's hilarious. But they're also color inserts, and like here's an example. And my father also did the cover.
so dope.
But my father's art is like a timeline for my life. Like I can look at one of his pieces of art and tell you what house we were living in. But it's also how I understand community, because so many of his pieces, they're either like we're the models or family is the models, or like people in the community are the models. And just being when you look at my father's art, there's no way that you look at it and don't see someone who just like deeply believes in humanity, you know? And so I think that like my father's art taught me that the way that we are taught to see the world doesn't have to be what we accept, because he revised it in his art and he saw something new every single time.
I love it. I want to get everybody's questions, but the greatest just asked the question. So when the greatest asks the question, we got to go to the greatest first.
Yeah, I got Mama Trisha.
Yeah. I'm sure there's other greatest in here, but for me, the greatest. I've come to realize that poetry is a remarkable grounding for writing in any genre. What did the poet in you bring to this difficult undertaking, the unearthing of these revelations? This is by Miss Patricia Smith.
Thank you, Miss Patricia Smith, for this question, and thank you for being here. I think the beauty of poetry, of being a poet, is we can't live in a world where a line only has one meaning. We don't have the space for that, right? That you always have to be having like, double meanings and squeezing the most out of the line, and also really pairing both the beauty and like the sharp edges. And so I think that in terms of like, I think like being a poet really added to the way I could essentially like release myself to language, because to be a poet, you just have to have a fundamental trust in language, you know? And so I think like really leaning into that. And I read a lot of poetry to write this book. I mean, the epigraphs of the book are from Arcelis Girmay and Nami Shihabnai. And there's a chapter in the book where it's talking about Glenda Moore, who during Hurricane Sandy, she's a Black woman, her two sons were essentially washed away in the hurricane because her neighbors wouldn't let them in when they were trying to get help. And she was like outside screaming for help for 12 hours. But I essentially analyzed that moment and her neighbor's white indifference through the poem On Kindness by R.S.L. Girmay, which is incredible. And the poem, is it C? It's the A24. I gotta look it up, but by Naomi Shebnai is one of her most famous poems. But kind of looking at, okay, that like poetry, I think, is also a way to empathize, because one of the things I talk about in that chapter is that, you know, you read essayists and novelists and all these other genres, and the first thing they tell you is empathy is out, empathy doesn't do anything, but no one has told that to the poets. You know, and just like, because like we're who people come to in their grief, you know, come to when they want to celebrate, you know. And so I think that really like, you know, forces you to, it demands an attention to the human spirit that I think that I was really appreciative of. And I read it just like in terms of like understanding like the sentence level, I read an enormous amount of Carl Phillips, just because that man is sentences. So I found it instrumental. And anytime I got stuck, I picked up a poetry book.
That's what's up. All right, we gonna mesh these last two, so you can answer them in any order you want. So this is gonna sound like a really basic question, but what was the biggest reason that you wanted to write this memoir and share your story? And this is an interesting question. Would you name the book again that was so important to your understanding of our cultural? Would you name the book?
Celeste answered that for me. The Harsha Walia Border and Rule.
Oh, okay, got it. All right, okay.
Everyone read that book. Absolutely incredible.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and Rising Racist National. All right, so the last question is, this is going to sound like a really basic question, but what was the biggest reason that you wanted to write this memoir and share your story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there were two reasons. This is not a basic question. It's like, it's actually one of like the hardest questions to answer, because I think you have to know the why, and the why can't be for yourself, right? That the point of like creating art in the world, I think, is to create a connection, to create understanding. And for me, there were two reasons. One is that I think that like Black people were always told, okay, listen, if you want to tell your story, pick one lane and talk about it. There no one that it's going to be impossible for anyone to understand all the things we have to experience as Black people, which essentially relegates the only option to be alienation. And I don't accept that. You know, I have to accept that, because like that's not true. So that was like a big part. But you know, the number one reason I actually wrote this, and it's one of the first chapters I actually like really wrote for this book, is because of Glenda Moore's story. And I remember I read about it shortly after Hurricane Sandy, and you know, I was in Brooklyn and I went to a friend's, we hunkered down the storm, we mainly gossiped and listened to Stevie Wonder, and it was cool, right? Everything was fine. I came back to my apartment, everything was fine. And meanwhile, this woman has lost her 3 and 4-year-old sons, and not just lost them, she was literally clinging to a tree branch for 12 hours and they're washed away. And her neighbor's whole thing was essentially that it sounded like a much bigger, Blacker man, you know, to like outside. And that's like why that they essentially just let her the other, but that's not true. There's a whole history that you have to understand in order for that to happen. But like that moment just stuck with me, and it just made me so sad, but like, but what do you do with your sadness, right? Especially for a stranger. I don't know London Moore, you can look away, but this idea that regardless of how sad it made me, that like that actually the only response to that sadness that could give me something beyond sadness was my attention to her and my witness to her, and this idea that like, even if I think I say something like, even if I could like unwed myself from this, like wed to her is still how I choose to remain, that there's something so necessary in healing and witnessing each other. And this is what Black people do. And the book is actually dedicated to her sons, Brandon and Connor. And so really one of the things I wanted to understand in the book is just like, how did that moment happen? Like, how the hell did that moment happen? Because they interviewed her like a neighbor after, and he was almost just indignant about it, that like he just kind of settled on she shouldn't have been out there. And I wanted to know, how did we get here, and what are all the things that had to happen to get here? Because like Glenda's story is also in just like, even though the results of it are different, it's also our story, right? That like that this country is death, and looking at like all the ways that like what happened to Glenda Moore and her husband, the loss of their children, that is one manifestation of this country, and I wanted to be like, okay, like, how do I understand this manifestation? How do we understand this? Because like, we need to know, and I also like needed to transform their memory, because everything I read about it was just, it was, the pieces you read after a tragedy, and just like, how can I make the witness more permanent?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
A little bit. You sound far away, but yeah. Yeah.
Can you not hear me?
We can hear you a little bit, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I hope y'all can hear me. I just want to say thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, the crickets are the loudest thing though.
It sounds like you've kind of receded into the background a little bit.
But we can hear you talk.
Yeah. How about now?
Hello?
Yeah, barely.
Yeah.
Barely. Well, this may be the cue. Wow, what an engaging conversation. Really grateful to both of you. I mean, I kind of wish it would just sort of go on. I really, from the heart, thank you both so very, very much. And congratulations, Hafizah Augustus Geter. What an amazing book. Kiese Laymon, thank you for doing the honors. And of course, thanks to everybody in the room for joining us. You helped complete the circle. As always, a big shout out and word of thanks to Abdi Omar and Marnie Folkman over at Penguin Random House for all their efforts in making tonight happen. I have posted links in the chat with which you may purchase copies of Black Period, as well as books by Kiese. Also want to remind everybody, City Lights is actually open for business. We have some new expanded hours. We're open Monday through Thursday, 11 to 8, and now Friday through Sunday, 11 to 9. We're slowly getting back to pre-pandemic hours. As many of you know, City Lights is also a publishing house as well as a bookstore. We continue to publish literature and translation, poetry, and books informed by a political outlook that is progressive. Visit citylights.com to learn more. We have some amazing new books coming out in the next season, new poetry by Will Alexander, much, much more. Tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So take care, everyone. We hope to see you all again soon.
Everyone, appreciate if you buy the book. Please support City Lights. And thank you everyone so much for coming.